Washington, D.C., January 20th, 1953. A hard winter wind pushed across Pennsylvania Avenue, carrying the low rumble of distant crowds gathering for the first inauguration since the end of the Korean War's bloodiest year. The city was awake long before sunrise. Soldiers stood rigid along the parade route. Police horses steamed in the cold. The White House windows glowed faintly against the pale sky. Inside, the ceremonial motorcade waited. The tradition was simple. The outgoing president and the incoming president ride together from the White House to the Capitol, symbolizing unity, continuity, and respect. But this morning, the back seat of the armored limousine remained empty. Harry S. Truman stood in the entrance hall, jaw tight, coat buttoned, eyes fixed on the driveway where Dwight D. Eisenhower should have arrived. Eisenhower, the general who commanded millions across Europe, was now president-elect. He was supposed to walk through the north portico, shake Truman's hand, and sit beside him. Instead, he stayed away, choosing to go directly to the Capitol rather than step into Truman's White House. No explanation, no courtesy call. Only a silent refusal. The cold outside matched the cold between the two men, and that quiet standoff set the tone for the hours ahead, pulling the story back to the years when their rivalry began. The hostility on Inauguration Day did not emerge suddenly. Its roots stretched back across the final years of World War II, the uncertain peace that followed, and the political turbulence of the early Cold War. When Harry Truman took office in April 1945, he inherited a military establishment shaped almost entirely by one man, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Supreme Commander of Allied expeditionary forces in Europe, Eisenhower's reputation was global. His command decisions had liberated continents, toppled totalitarian regimes, and coordinated the largest coalition army in modern history. Truman respected the victory, but did not trust the military culture Eisenhower represented. Truman came into power committed to civilian primacy. He had risen through politics, not war. He fought constantly to assert that elected authority stood above military prestige, even when the uniforms belonged to national heroes. The firing of Douglas MacArthur in 1951 defined his stance, but the tension started earlier. Eisenhower's wartime fame made him an independent force in American public life. Truman knew it. Congress knew it. Their relationship became a strained courtesy, polite in photographs, cold in private exchanges. The next layer of friction came from NATO. When Eisenhower was appointed the first Supreme Allied Commander Europe in 1950, he became the living embodiment of Western defense. Truman approved the position but disliked the public elevation it gave Eisenhower. The general traveled across Europe, receiving cheering crowds, parliamentary honors, and the gratitude of governments looking for stability. Meanwhile, Truman struggled with economic challenges, partisan attacks, and accusations over the handling of the Korean War. Eisenhower's international stature grew stronger, Truman's domestic position grew weaker. The Korean War deepened the divide. Truman believed Eisenhower should defend the administration's strategy. Eisenhower remained neutral in public and private, refusing to tie himself to policies he did not fully control. Each silence irritated Truman. Each polite distance appeared calculated. By 1951, their interactions became mechanical, brief, formal, stripped of warmth. The turning point came when Truman attempted to pull Eisenhower into democratic politics. He suggested that Eisenhower consider running for president on the Democratic ticket, or at least publicly reject Republican overtures. Eisenhower refused. He kept his intentions concealed, refusing to give Truman any advantage. What Truman saw as disloyalty, Eisenhower viewed as necessary neutrality. The moment created a breach that never closed. When Eisenhower finally declared his Republican candidacy in 1952, the personal wound became political. Truman felt used, believing Eisenhower had concealed ambitions while benefiting from the administration's support during the NATO years. Eisenhower felt misrepresented, believing Truman tried to weaponize him. Their public exchanges grew sharper. Their private communications vanished entirely. By the time the election ended, the two men stopped hiding their resentment. Truman believed Eisenhower allowed his supporters to attack the record of General George C. Marshall, Truman's closest national security advisor, and a figure Truman regarded with near reverence. Eisenhower believed Truman had dragged the presidency into partisan bitterness and refused to defend his own conduct. Every issue, every decision, every symbolic gesture became a point of friction. The inauguration rehearsal schedules, normally handled quietly by staff, became tense negotiations. Truman expected Eisenhower to follow tradition, arrive at the White House, meet the outgoing president, and ride together in the same car. Eisenhower saw no reason to participate in what he viewed as a staged demonstration of unity. He preferred to avoid the White House entirely and begin the day at the Capitol. Truman took that refusal as a personal insult. Eisenhower saw it as a procedural choice with no emotional meaning. This accumulation of political rivalry, clashing identities, and unresolved grievances set the stage for the silent confrontation on the morning of January 20th, 1953. An inauguration defined less by ceremony than by the final breakdown of a relationship shaped by war, ambition, and authority. The deeper origins of the Truman-Eisenhower rupture lay in the years when both men operated at different ends of American power, one as commander of millions, the other as the accidental president thrust into responsibility after Franklin Roosevelt's death. The contrast was structural. Eisenhower represented the professional military establishment at its strongest moment in U.S. history. Truman represented civilian authority at its most vulnerable. That imbalance never corrected itself. Early meetings between the two men were stiff, marked by Truman's need for blunt clarity and Eisenhower's preference for measured diplomatic restraint. Truman expected military obedience. Eisenhower delivered military precision, but withheld political loyalty. That distance hardened into mistrust when post-war politics began reshaping both of their futures. In 1950, as Republican strategists began floating Eisenhower's name for national office, Truman interpreted the silence that followed as a betrayal of principle. In his view, no serving general, especially one elevated by the presidency and entrusted with NATO command, should allow political speculation to flourish unchecked. Eisenhower disagreed. He considered political neutrality an obligation of military service, and he rejected Truman's expectation that he openly distance himself from the Republican Party. The result was a slow accumulation of resentment. Truman believed Eisenhower enjoyed political protection while avoiding political responsibility. Eisenhower believed Truman asked him to violate military propriety. That tension intensified when Senator Joseph McCarthy began attacking General George C. Marshall, calling him responsible for losing China. Marshall was Eisenhower, mentor, and Truman's most trusted statesman. Truman expected Eisenhower to publicly defend Marshall against McCarthy's accusations. Eisenhower refused, believing that involving himself in partisan combat would dishonor his military position and jeopardize the NATO mission. Truman never forgave that silence. He viewed it as a violation of loyalty. In his private writings, he branded Eisenhower's decision as cowardice, stating that no true leader would watch an honorable soldier be slandered for political gain. Eisenhower believed Truman misread him. He saw the attacks as political noise that would eventually collapse under their own weight. But the damage was already in place. Each man saw the other as acting on self-interest at a moment that required principle. The 1952 election campaign transformed these private grievances into public confrontation. Truman refused to run for re-election, but made no effort to hide his disdain for Eisenhower's candidacy. Eisenhower, in return, allowed his campaign to criticize the Truman administration's handling of Korea, inflation, and national security. The attacks were moderate by later political standards, but for Truman they were unforgivable. He believed Eisenhower knew better, that the general understood the complexity of global strategy and still permitted simplistic blame to circulate for political gain. As the election approached, their relationship descended into open hostility. Truman complained to aides that Eisenhower had no idea what the presidency requires. Eisenhower confided that Truman's behavior made dignified transition nearly impossible. Staff on both sides exchanged messages in clipped, formal language, avoiding any interpretation that might inflame tensions further. Every detail, from who controlled the briefing documents to where meetings would be held, became a symbolic contest. By late December 1952, the transition had devolved into parallel operations. Eisenhower's team established independent channels with federal agencies rather than rely on Truman's White House staff. Truman responded by reducing personal involvement, signing only necessary documents and leaving the remainder to advisors. Their final face-to-face meeting, held on November 18, 1952, produced no warmth. Truman offered official cooperation. Eisenhower accepted it with visible reluctance. Neither attempted small talk. The unresolved hostility carried into the planning for Inauguration Day. Truman assumed Eisenhower would follow tradition, arrive at the White House, greet the outgoing president, and travel together in a shared limousine. For Truman, tradition symbolized a peaceful handover of power. For Eisenhower, tradition symbolized political theater he no longer wished to participate in. He preferred to avoid any scene that might imply harmony where none existed. The contradiction was unbridgeable. Truman demanded respect for the office. Eisenhower demanded respect for personal boundaries. Neither bent. The refusal to ride together became inevitable weeks before the inauguration. Truman interpreted it as humiliation. Eisenhower viewed it as practicality. Their perceptions moved further apart with every passing day. By the morning of January 20, 1953, the breach was complete. One man waited in the White House, determined to uphold a ritual he believed essential to the Republic. The other stood outside the city's ceremonial traditions, prepared to assume the presidency without acknowledging the man who would hand it to him. The symbolic clash was set, opening the way to the multi-layered angles that reveal why the conflict endures in historical memory. The story of Eisenhower's refusal cannot be understood through chronology alone. Its meaning comes into focus only when examined through the overlapping angles that shaped both men's choices. The first is human, two individuals conditioned by different worlds, carrying different burdens and driven by different instincts. Eisenhower lived decades inside a hierarchy where discipline governed every movement. His authority was earned through coordination, restraint, and the ability to maintain neutral judgment under pressure. He disliked personal conflict and avoided emotional entanglements. Truman was the opposite. He valued directness, clarity, and loyalty. He did not separate the personal from the professional. An insult to a friend was an insult to the presidency. A breach in courtesy was a breach in order. Their temperaments were incompatible. Eisenhower saw ritual as performance. Truman saw ritual as duty. When Truman expected Eisenhower to defend George Marshall, he believed he was asking for moral clarity. When Eisenhower refused, he believed he was preserving propriety. Both men acted according to their own logic. Both believed they were right. That certainty pushed them further apart. The coldness on inauguration morning was not the reaction of strangers. It was the culmination of years of internal calculation. Truman viewed Eisenhower's absence from the White House as a deliberate show of disrespect. Eisenhower viewed attendance as an unnecessary confrontation with a man he no longer trusted. Neither interpretation imagined the other's perspective. Their emotions locked them into opposing positions long before dawn broke on January 20, 1953. To Truman, politics was not a battlefield. It was a series of obligations. To Eisenhower, politics was a terrain filled with hidden pressure. When Truman sought public support during the Korean War, he believed Eisenhower's voice carried authority. Eisenhower believed entering the political conversation would compromise military neutrality and damage U.S. credibility abroad. Truman approached every dispute as an argument to be won. Eisenhower approached disputes as hazards to be navigated. This divergence shaped every confrontation. When Truman attempted to secure Eisenhower for the Democratic ticket, he believed he was offering the general a stable platform. Eisenhower saw a trap. Truman expected gratitude. Eisenhower felt suspicion. The conflict hardened into strategy. Truman used speeches to define Eisenhower's responsibilities. Eisenhower used silence as insulation. Each move deepened the belief that the other was acting in bad faith. The tactical misalignment reached its peak during the 1952 campaign. Eisenhower allowed his campaign to criticize Truman's foreign policy, especially the Korean stalemate. Truman interpreted this as deliberate undermining by a man who understood the complexities of international conflict and chose to ignore them. Eisenhower believed he was addressing national issues, not Truman personally. Both saw the other as acting strategically against them. The inauguration became the final expression of that logic. The most powerful force shaping their conflict came from the institutions they represented. Truman saw himself as the guardian of civilian supremacy. Eisenhower embodied the professional military. The civilian-military divide was not theoretical. It touched every policy debate of the late 1940s and early 1950s. Truman feared a military figure gaining political control and reshaping the presidency around command structures. Eisenhower feared a political leader misusing military prestige and dragging the armed forces into partisan conflict. Their disagreements over NATO, Korea, and national security messaging were expressions of this institutional tension. When Eisenhower accepted the NATO command, Truman interpreted the public admiration that followed as political leverage. When Truman made decisions that affected military operations, Eisenhower analyzed them through the lens of strategic consequences. The two roles collided repeatedly. Neither man saw the other's sphere as fully legitimate without oversight. Each believed his institution carried the responsibility of national survival. The weight of those institutions turned personal friction into structural opposition. Symbols carried different meanings for each man. Truman valued ceremony. Eisenhower valued authenticity. A motorcade tradition, in Truman's view, represented the peaceful continuity of the Republic. Every president since the 19th century had honored it. Eisenhower saw no reason to participate if the sentiment behind the gesture was hollow. In his judgment, appearing beside Truman would misrepresent their relationship and create a false sense of unity. For Truman, the refusal threatened the dignity of the presidency. For Eisenhower, participation threatened the dignity of his own principles. The symbolism of the White House driveway became the stage for their final disagreement. Truman stood behind the glass doors waiting for a man who would never enter. Eisenhower waited at the Capitol, unwilling to cross the threshold into a building he believed had been used against him during the campaign. The symbolism was identical in form, but opposite in meaning. These angles locked both men into positions neither could abandon. They shaped the cold atmosphere of that January morning and made the modest act of entering a doorway impossible. The convergence of personality, strategy, institution, and symbolism set the conditions for the next angles that further reveal the complexity behind the conflict's final moments. The conflict between Truman and Eisenhower extended beyond personality, strategy, and symbolism. It unfolded across the broader landscape of public perception, ceremonial expectation, and historical precedent. These additional angles reveal how the tension grew into an unprecedented break in presidential tradition. Public opinion shaped both men's behavior long before the inauguration. Eisenhower was, in the eyes of millions, the architect of victory in Europe. His wartime decisions carried moral weight. His steady demeanor projected confidence. When he returned home, Americans treated him less like a general and more like a national guardian. Truman, by contrast, lived under constant criticism. He made politically costly decisions, recognizing Israel, integrating the military, firing General MacArthur, and managing a grinding conflict in Korea. Each action was justified by principle, but the political price was steep. The imbalance in public approval intensified their conflict. Truman believed Eisenhower benefited from admiration without carrying equivalent burdens. Eisenhower believed Truman's frustrations reflected political exhaustion, not injustice. During the 1952 campaign, Eisenhower's rallies overflowed with crowds. Truman's speeches drew skepticism and fatigue. Truman observed the contrast and interpreted it as evidence that Eisenhower encouraged attacks on his administration. Eisenhower saw it as proof that the nation wanted new leadership. Both understood that the public viewed the incoming president as a figure of integrity and the outgoing president as a figure weighed down by war and controversy. This public imbalance heightened the stakes of every symbolic interaction. Truman feared appearing diminished beside Eisenhower on Inauguration Day. Eisenhower feared appearing complicit in policies he had criticized. Their reactions were shaped by how they believed the nation would interpret a shared motorcade. Public perception had become a battlefield neither man could escape. The inauguration ceremony was not a social invitation. It was a constitutional choreography refined across generations. The departing president welcomed the incoming president at the White House. They rode together in one car. They arrived as a unified symbol of the peaceful transfer of power. Truman believed this ritual was essential. He believed the office required personal humility, even in moments of private frustration. Eisenhower saw the ritual as unnecessary pageantry. He preferred clarity of action over ceremonial display. Behind the scenes, staff from both teams tried to negotiate the details. Truman's aides insisted on the traditional sequence. Eisenhower's aides proposed alternatives. Neither side wanted open confrontation, but neither side yielded. The motorcade was more than transportation. It was a stage for national unity. Truman wanted continuity. Eisenhower wanted separation. Their disagreement was a perfect reflection of their broader divide. By rejecting the White House visit, Eisenhower broke a precedent that had stood for decades. In doing so, he delivered a message: the relationship was beyond repair. For Truman, the refusal felt deeply personal. He believed the ceremony honored the Republic, not the man. He considered the White House a symbol of democratic continuity. Eisenhower considered the White House, in that moment, a symbol of political conflict. Truman felt custodial responsibility. Eisenhower felt emotional distance. Each interpreted the same ritual through incompatible frameworks. Tense presidential relationships were not new, but no modern example matched the Truman-Eisenhower break. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams clashed ideologically, but they still observed formal courtesies. Andrew Jackson refused to meet John Quincy Adams before inauguration, but that rupture grew from bitter electoral scandal. In the 20th century, despite ideological differences, presidents maintained ceremony. Hoover greeted Roosevelt. Truman greeted both Roosevelt and Churchill during wartime transitions. Even when private bitterness existed, public ritual held steady. Eisenhower's decision broke from that tradition. His choice marked the first time in modern American history that an incoming president refused the courtesy of entering the departing president's residence. It was unprecedented not for its hostility, but for its clarity. Eisenhower wanted no misinterpretation. He wanted no staged unity. He believed a forced display would contradict the independence he needed as a leader. Truman believed the disruption jeopardized the dignity of the presidency. Historians later framed this moment as the culmination of competing visions of authority: Truman's belief in civilian oversight and institutional respect, and Eisenhower's belief in personal integrity and cautious distance. Each acted according to a different historical script. Their actions reinforced their principles rather than contradicting them. The conflict was not a failure of character, but a collision of legacies. Together, these angles revealed the depth behind a decision that, on the surface, seemed simple: refusing a ride, declining an invitation, avoiding a doorway. Yet each gesture carried layers of meaning: the weight of public sentiment, the expectations of tradition, and the long memory of presidential history. These forces converged in the hours leading to the most uncomfortable inauguration transfer of the Cold War era, setting the stage for the moment when the private tension became a public turning point. Dawn settled slowly over Washington. On January 20th, 1953, the White House staff moved with rigid precision, rehearsing a ceremony they had performed for generations. The Marine Band waited at the driveway. Secret Service agents checked the motorcade formation. Photographers positioned themselves for the moment when the two presidents would emerge side by side. Everything was prepared for the image of continuity. But the man at the center of it, President Harry S. Truman, stood alone. He wore a dark overcoat and a narrow tie, the same style he had favored throughout his presidency. His face showed the strain of years spent navigating war, reconstruction, and political division. He remained at the North Portico because tradition demanded it. In his understanding, the office required him to greet the incoming president at the front door, no matter their personal history. Minutes passed. Staff whispered updates. The head usher stepped close and delivered the message no one wanted to repeat: President-elect Eisenhower was not coming. Eisenhower was already en route to the Capitol. The breach was unmistakable. Truman heard the words without reacting. He simply adjusted his gloves and looked toward the driveway where the motorcade sat idle. He understood the symbolism far better than most. The refusal turned the quiet space between two men into a national statement. Across the city, Eisenhower traveled by car with his wife, Mamie. His route bypassed the White House entirely. The decision was deliberate. He wanted no staged farewell, no forced cordiality, no photograph designed to imply reconciliation. In his view, the day belonged to the country, not to fractured relationships inside the political class. The presidency required honesty, and he refused to portray unity where none existed. The contrast between the two scenes, Truman frozen at the North Portico, Eisenhower speeding toward the Capitol, captured the emotional climax of their long-standing conflict. Inside the White House, aides tried to manage the moment. Some urged Truman to return inside and prepare for departure. Others recommended continuing the schedule without acknowledging the break. Truman responded with curt precision. He would leave on time. He would follow the established procedure. He would maintain dignity regardless of Eisenhower's choice. He walked through the hallways he had lived in for nearly 8 years. Portraits of previous presidents watched from the walls. The building felt still, as if holding its breath while the machinery of government shifted from one leader to the next. Truman did not look back. He moved past the portraits toward the waiting car, alone. At the same moment, Eisenhower's motorcade approached the Capitol. Crowds lined the streets, cheering the general who had led them through the worst conflict in human history. The applause echoed against the marble buildings. Eisenhower acknowledged the people but kept his attention forward. For him, the inauguration represented duty, not celebration. He believed the nation needed steadiness more than ceremony. When Truman's car finally pulled away from the White House, without Eisenhower beside him, it marked the first ceremonial fracture of the day. Reporters in nearby vehicles recorded the moment, noting the absence without commentary. The symbolism was plain. The transition would proceed, but it would not be unified. As Truman's car moved toward the Capitol, the gap became a narrative of its own. Two presidents traveling the same route in separate worlds. One outgoing, carrying the weight of decisions that had reshaped the post-war order. One incoming, carrying the expectations of millions who saw him as the architect of a new era. The final convergence awaited them inside the Capitol building, where the Constitution, not personal sentiment, would close the distance between them. The oath of office would bring them into the same space, but it would not bridge the distance formed over years of rivalry, silence, and conflicting interpretations of duty. Everything that happened next, the final handshake, the last exchange of words, the ceremony on the inaugural platform, would unfold under the shadow created by Eisenhower's refusal at the White House door. Truman arrived at the Capitol first. His car rolled to a stop beneath the stone arches of the Senate wing, the cold air funneling through the open corridors. He stepped out with the measured steadiness that had carried him through crises far greater than ceremonial insult. Senators greeted him with polite formality. Photographers captured his controlled expression. He did not acknowledge the break in tradition. He did not speak about Eisenhower. He moved with the gravity of a man who understood that this day belonged to history, not to emotion. Inside, the congressional leadership escorted Truman to a small reception room reserved for the outgoing president. It was designed for quiet reflection, a space where the departing leader could gather himself before witnessing the transfer of power. Truman remained standing. His mind was disciplined, focused on the obligation ahead, to witness the oath, to depart without spectacle, and to allow the peaceful transition of authority that defined the republic. Moments later, Eisenhower's motorcade approached the Capitol. The cheering rose again, an unmistakable wave of admiration that followed him everywhere since 1945. Eisenhower stepped out of the vehicle with his characteristic calm, shoulders straight, jaw set, eyes forward. His uniformed past lived in his posture. His new civilian role lived in his silence. He entered the building through a separate entrance, escorted by congressional officials. His path did not cross Truman's. The architecture itself seemed to enforce the distance between them, each man walking through a different corridor toward the same constitutional moment. When Eisenhower reached the holding room for the president-elect, he greeted congressional leaders with brief nods. His focus was fixed on the oath, the responsibilities that followed, and the need to begin governing immediately. The split from tradition at the White House was behind him. He believed the country needed clarity, not staged reconciliation. When the time came for the formal procession to the inaugural platform, the two men finally converged. Truman exited his room first, escorted by Senate leaders. Eisenhower followed a minute later. They stood near each other in the marble hallway outside the Senate chamber, each waiting for the signal to move forward. For the first time that day, they shared the same air. Witnesses later described the moment as restrained. No handshake, no exchange of words, no attempt to soften the distance. Truman looked straight ahead. Eisenhower maintained a neutral expression. Their proximity changed nothing. Years of resentment remained intact. The silence between them held the weight of every unresolved disagreement. from the Marshall Dispute to the Bruising Campaign, from conflicting principles to clashing identities. When the doors opened, they stepped onto the inaugural platform. The cold wind swept across the stands. Thousands of spectators waited, wrapped in heavy coats, their breath rising in the air. The Marine Band played. Congressional officers took their positions. The moment was ceremonial, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. Truman sat behind Eisenhower, his face composed but remote. Eisenhower moved to the podium as Chief Justice Earl Warren stepped forward to administer the oath of office. The words carried across the loudspeakers, the constitutional transfer of power, completed without reconciliation, without unity, without symbolic continuity. Eisenhower repeated the oath with steady clarity. At that instant, Truman ceased to be president. The applause that followed marked a new era, one shaped by the expectations placed on Eisenhower's leadership. The general-turned-statesman now held responsibility not for armies, but for a nation at the height of Cold War uncertainty. After the ceremony, Truman stood to leave. Custom dictated that the outgoing president depart before the new one began his duties. Eisenhower did not accompany him. Truman walked down the platform steps with a firm stride, refusing to show the bitterness he carried. Cameras captured the moment with stark neutrality, the former president descending alone, the new president standing above, receiving the nation's applause. As Truman exited the Capitol, he paused briefly to look at the crowd. He had governed through some of the most complex years in American history. Now his part in the nation's leadership was finished. His final act was complete. Inside, Eisenhower turned toward the congressional leaders awaiting him. His inauguration would proceed. Luncheons, briefings, the first executive decisions. But the morning's rupture remained embedded in the narrative of the day. The refusal at the White House had shaped the inauguration, defined the tone, and exposed the unresolved divide between two men who carried the weight of war, politics, and authority on their shoulders. That divide set the conditions for the aftermath, a period in which the consequences of the inauguration insult would stretch far beyond a single ceremony. The motorcade carrying Truman away from the Capitol moved with no escort from the new administration. That absence signaled the true fracture, not public hostility but institutional coldness. Truman sat rigid in the back seat, hands folded, jaw locked. He had endured the repudiation without outward reaction, but the insult hardened into something permanent the moment he left the inaugural grounds. He no longer held authority. He held memory, judgment, and the unfiltered truth of what the transition revealed about Eisenhower's regard for him. At the Capitol, Eisenhower completed the final ceremonial obligations, but attention had already shifted to governing. He understood the optics of the morning. He understood the criticism it would attract from historians and political observers. He treated it as irrelevant. His priority was execution of policy, not preservation of tradition. The inauguration had fulfilled its constitutional requirement. Truman's presence had fulfilled the peaceful transfer. The rest, for Eisenhower, carried no operational significance. Within hours, the first accounts of the morning circulated through Washington. Staffers, journalists, congressional aides, each repeated a slightly different version of the same core fact. The president-elect had refused to meet Truman at the White House. The city processed the information with the kind of intensity reserved for breaches of long-standing norms. Some viewed it as unnecessary provocation. Others viewed it as a calculated assertion of independence. A smaller group viewed it as justified retaliation for the grievances Eisenhower carried from the 1948 and 1952 political conflicts. The rupture initiated a new political dynamic. Eisenhower's administration began without the customary goodwill extended to new presidents by their predecessors. Truman's allies interpreted the refusal as a personal attack. Eisenhower's supporters framed it as a signal that the new president would not inherit Truman's worldview or his political attachments. The event created a fault line that shaped early bureaucratic behavior. Departments and agencies aligned themselves cautiously, uncertain whether cooperation with the previous administration's officials would be tolerated or punished. Truman returned to private life, determined to maintain dignity, but privately he recorded the full depth of his contempt. His diary entries from the period became blunt, unfiltered assessments of Eisenhower's character and leadership. He viewed the refusal not as a symbolic gesture, but as a manifestation of Eisenhower's fundamental misunderstanding of civilian authority and executive responsibility. Truman interpreted the insult as proof that Eisenhower remained at his core a commanding officer rather than a political leader accountable to democratic norms. Eisenhower proceeded as if the rupture held no relevance. His staff, however, recognized its strategic implications. The absence of a cooperative handoff complicated early operational planning. Truman's team, offended by the treatment of their former president, provided only the minimum legally required information. There were no informal briefings, no operational shortcuts, no institutional wisdom passed across the transition boundary. The administration entered office at a disadvantage, self-inflicted, avoidable, and obvious to anyone studying the machinery of government. Inside the Pentagon, senior officers interpreted the morning through their own lens. Eisenhower remained the most respected general of the modern era. Truman remained the commander-in-chief who had dismissed one of their own, Douglas MacArthur. Many officers viewed the refusal as symbolic rebalancing. They interpreted the moment as a recalibration of authority from Truman's civilian assertiveness back toward Eisenhower's military-derived decisiveness. This interpretation was inaccurate but influential. It shaped early military support for Eisenhower's strategic decisions and established a tone of institutional loyalty not to the presidency, but to the man who now occupied it. Truman's resentment did not fade, it calcified. For the remainder of his life, he maintained an unambiguous condemnation of Eisenhower's behavior that morning. He cited it as evidence of a character flaw, an inability to respect the traditions that bound the office. His criticism was not rooted in emotion. It was rooted in his belief that the presidency required strict adherence to norms that protected constitutional continuity. Eisenhower rarely discussed the event again. He refused to justify it publicly. He treated it as a closed chapter, an administrative detail beneath his attention. His silence preserved the ambiguity of motive, allowing future generations to argue endlessly about whether the refusal was personal, strategic, or simply a miscalculation. The aftermath extended far beyond personal resentment. It defined the relational architecture between former and sitting presidents for decades. The expectation of mutual respect weakened. The precedent of distance, symbolic and procedural, entered the political repertoire. Future transitions referenced 1953 as an example of how easily tradition could be discarded without immediate institutional collapse. The consequences were clear. The inauguration morning did not create open conflict, but it created permanent separation. Truman and Eisenhower occupied the same historical ledger, but never again the same moral or political space. 8,888. In the weeks following the inauguration, the ramifications of Eisenhower's refusal continued to ripple through Washington. Newspapers dissected the breach with meticulous attention, balancing admiration for Eisenhower's leadership with criticism of his apparent discourtesy. Columnists debated the interpretation. Some saw a deliberate insult. Others saw a man intent on separating politics from governance. For historians, it became a case study in how personal history shapes institutional procedure. Eisenhower moved quickly to assert control over the new administration. Cabinet appointments, military directives, and foreign policy briefings were executed with precision. His focus on efficiency and effectiveness overshadowed any ceremonial discord. To him, the refusal at the White House was already irrelevant, its meaning contained only in the perception of others. He prioritized operational clarity, setting a tone that emphasized results over optics. The inauguration had been a formal necessity. The work of governing demanded no participation in symbolic reconciliation. Truman, in contrast, spent the first weeks of 1953 reflecting on the personal and political dimensions of the rupture. In letters and memoirs, he described Eisenhower's decision as a breach of respect that violated both personal loyalty and the dignity of the office. He viewed it as a calculated assertion of independence, a move that signaled Eisenhower's intention to redefine the relationship between civilian authority and former leadership. For Truman, the incident confirmed his suspicion that Eisenhower's fame and authority created a subtle but dangerous imbalance in American politics. A man elevated by public adulation could challenge tradition without immediate consequence. The public, meanwhile, interpreted the moment with mixed clarity. Some praised Eisenhower for decisive independence, seeing the refusal as a clear signal that he would govern on his own terms. Others criticized him as arrogant, highlighting the disruption to ceremony as evidence of personal animosity. The polarized reception reflected the enduring tension between symbolic expectations and operational necessity that had defined the morning. Institutionally, the rupture prompted subtle changes in transition practices. Staff for subsequent administrations noted that personal rivalries could disrupt ceremonial expectations, and contingency planning began to include protocols for independent arrivals, staggered briefings, and separate motorcades. Eisenhower's choice became an unspoken precedent. The peaceful transfer of power required constitutional adherence, but ritual unity was negotiable. The breach demonstrated that the legal framework of democracy could withstand individual conflicts even as tradition was tested. Historians later emphasized the lasting significance of this moment. Truman's bitterness and Eisenhower's indifference revealed contrasting philosophies of leadership, one rooted in the moral authority of office, the other in the practical authority of action. Eisenhower's military experience informed his understanding of command, hierarchy, and decision-making, which he applied to the presidency with minimal accommodation for precedent or sentiment. Truman's political sensibilities emphasized continuity, symbolism, and moral propriety, which he saw as essential to the health of the republic. The collision of these perspectives produced a rupture that, while not destabilizing, exposed the vulnerabilities of tradition. For Eisenhower, the refusal had operational advantages. It allowed him to bypass political theatrics and begin immediate governance, ensuring clarity in policy execution. For Truman, the absence confirmed a personal defeat, a symbolic slight that extended beyond politics into the realm of pride, legacy, and principle. Each man's interpretation reinforced his own worldview, deepening the historical narrative of rivalry and authority. The morning's fracture left a permanent imprint. No immediate conflict arose, but the subtle erosion of ceremonial expectation persisted. The inauguration became a reference point for evaluating the balance between public ritual and personal discretion. The incident illustrated that leadership, even in a democracy defined by process, carries the imprint of human judgment, personality, and unresolved grievance. The rupture of January 20th, 1953 was complete, setting the stage for a reflective closure on what it revealed about power, principle, and historical consequence. The refusal of Dwight D. Eisenhower to enter Harry Truman's White House on Inauguration Day 1953 was more than a breach of ceremonial protocol. It was a crystallization of decades of tension between two men whose lives had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances, global war, national security crises, and the unrelenting demands of leadership. One man carried the moral authority of office, the other the operational authority of command. Their collision revealed how personal principle and institutional responsibility can diverge, producing gestures whose significance outlasts the moment. Eisenhower's decision reflected his philosophy of governance, clarity of purpose over performative tradition, pragmatism over sentiment, and independence over compromise. For him, leadership was measured by action, by the capacity to execute decisions with precision, and by the ability to navigate political pressures without surrendering autonomy. Truman's reaction reflected a contrasting philosophy. The presidency was a moral center, ceremonial observances were more than formalities, and personal respect was inseparable from institutional integrity. The refusal to ride together was not a trivial slight. It symbolized a fundamental disagreement over the nature of authority. The episode illuminated broader truths about power and transition. Rituals and conventions exist to reinforce continuity, but they cannot substitute for personal alignment or mutual trust. Even in a democracy with codified procedures, the character and choices of individuals shape outcomes, perceptions, and historical memory. The rupture of January 20s demonstrated that leadership involves not only competence and legitimacy, but also the navigation of human complexity, pride, and resentment. Historically, the moment remains a lens for understanding civil-military relations, the politics of transition, and the enduring influence of personal dynamics on public institutions. It stands as a reminder that history is rarely smooth or harmonious. Even in moments defined by legality and ceremony, the subtle interplay of character, principle, and perception can redefine the narrative. Eisenhower's silent refusal and Truman's steadfast presence became a lasting tableau, two leaders bound by duty, divided by perspective, and immortalized in the quiet tension of a single January morning